18. Degradation. In Genesis 3:1-5, we have very plainly stated Satan's plan of salvation. Its essence is basically this: man can become his own God, independent from God the Creator, and man can decide for himself what constitutes good and evil. God, the Creator, is trying to prevent his creatures, men and angels, from realizing that they possess God's powers and can strike out on their own and create their own world of law and also live forever in spite of what God has declared. This program has not changed. As against God, man sets himself up as his own God. Philip Blair Jones has commented on this, pointing out that, quote, "Cant and equivocation aside, the world's battle is being fought between two armies. On the one side is the religion of humanity, on the other is Christianity in its splendor, Calvinism. Quote, he who believes in God without reserve and is determined that God shall be God to him, in all this thinking, feeling, willing, in the entire compass of his life activities, intellectual, moral, spiritual, throughout all his individual, social, religious relations, is, by force of that strictest of law logic, which presides over the outworking of principles into thought and life, by the very necessity of the case, a Calvinist." End quote. So spoke Dr. B.B. Warfield in 1909 at Princeton Seminary for the 400th anniversary of the birth of John Calvin. Substitute the words quote-unquote man for quote-unquote God and quote-unquote humanist for quote-unquote Calvinist in the above quote, and the followers of humanity's religion are contrasted with their opponents. End quote. Moreover, as against God's law, man proclaims his freedom from law and his right to make his own law. Basic to the satanic faith is the denial of any validity to God's law. The only valid law is that which a man makes for himself, the law of his desires and wishes. Again, quote, "Ye shall not surely die," end quote, is still Satan's plan. Men are certain that, with sufficient scientific advance, death will be overcome and God's decree nullified. All that man needs is enough time, and he shall rival and surpass the God of Scripture. Very clearly also, Satan insisted that God was a liar, selfishly and jealously guarding his godhood to prevent anyone else from realizing their own divinity. Quote, "Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods," or as God, "knowing good and evil." Genesis 3:1, 4, and 5. This same point is again made by Satan to God with respect to Job. Quote, "Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. Put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face." Job 1, 9-11. Satan's indictment of Job is really an indirect indictment of God. First, Satan is indicating that God is wrong about Job, Job 1:8, and Job's character. Satan clearly professes to have greater insight into reality than does God. Implicit in Satan's contempt for Job is a greater contempt for God. Second, Satan's charge is that Job, like every other man, is only concerned with self-interest. There is no morality or righteousness in Job's stand, according to Satan, having been richly blessed by God. Job is simply being pragmatic and selfish in worshipping God, because that honour accorded to God serves Job's self-interest. Remove protection and blessing from Job, Satan declares, and, quote, "He will curse thee to thy face," end quote. Satan, of course, proves to be radically wrong. Job, while perplexed at the calamities which befall him, still retains his faith and trust in God. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." Job 13:15. It was the false idea of God and God's justice held by his friends that Job protested against. Third, what Satan says about Job, he is really saying about God, in whose image man is made. Satan confuses aseity, self-being, with egoism and selfishness. In speaking to Eve, he had plainly accused God of lying to man to prevent man from becoming a god. God was supposedly jealously and selfishly guarding divinity and life as though he alone had an unrestricted right to them. For Satan, Job was selfish and egocentric, and God was as well. Quote, "Skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. Put forth thine hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face." Job 2, 4 and 5. Satan was here projecting his own views onto God and to Job. For Satan, the goal was and is to be his own God, his own universe, and his own determiner of good and evil, and this is his program for all men. Let all, quote, do their own thing without any interference from God. To prove his point about God, it was necessary for Satan to degrade Job, to prove that Job was only capable of raw self-interest, and to prove thereby that God was wrong both about Job and about his own being. For the same reason, Satan was the accuser of Joshua, trying to make of that high priest's sins an evidence of apostasy and a common cause with Satan. Zechariah 3, 1-5. Similarly, the temptation of our Lord by Satan was consistently an appeal to self-interest, power and prestige. Surely Jesus would succumb to so masterly an appeal to his self-interest. It is clear that many theologians have been radically wrong in their interpretation of Satan and, accordingly, of God, by failing to see the meaning of his appearance in Job. Consider these absurd and blasphemous comments of E.S.P. Havener concerning Satan in Job 1, 6-12. Quote, "We are not to look for any full-dress doctrine of Satan as depicted in Orthodox theology. He does not appear as a fallen angel, but has regular access to heaven." 1:6-1. The name Satan 6 is preceded by the definite article and is rendered by, quote, "the adversary," end quote, in Moffat. Professor N.H. Snaith summarizes his role by saying, quote, "He is God's inspector of man on earth and man's adversary in heaven," end quote. He is a divine agent whose duty it is to give the closest attention to human virtue and vice. He appears as the supreme cynic of the heavenly court, end quote, end quote. The purpose of Satan's actions against Job was to degrade Job to Satan's level, to reduce Job to a person whose only and entire motive was self-interest and egoism. All the calamities visited upon Job had no other purpose than to force Job to reveal that he was really no more different from Satan than any of Satan's cohorts. Their purpose was to demonstrate that both Job and God operated purely in terms of self-interest, each his own world and law, only conceding to others what self-interest dictated. Job, Satan wanted to prove, did not serve God for naught. He expected the reward and paid God in worship and praise. God, in turn, blessed Job in order to have the satisfaction of Job's bowing and scraping. Whereas Satan's plan is honest freedom for every man to be his own self-centered world and law. Satan's purpose, then, is to prove his point by degrading a saint of God before God and man, to demonstrate that what God and his servants regard with horror is the reality of things and simply to be accepted and enjoyed. Jacques Barzin gives us a vivid example of this delight in degrading. Wordsworth's serious and moralistic life and poetry are an offence to most humanistic scholars, and judging by their classroom comments, many find such evidences of character an offence in any great literary figure. When it was discovered in the 20th century that Wordsworth had an illicit relationship in his youth, which led to an illegitimate daughter, a Harvard scholar, according to Barzin, received the news with the comment, quote, "It makes him seem like one of us," end quote. The thesis is, let us all be bastards together. Why pretend to something more than a man bent on getting all he can in contempt of God and man? Politicians thus appeal in moralistic terms to the mob that they often despise, for the people want nobility and morality to cloak their naked self-interest. Privately, they commonly express cynicism concerning moral absolutes. Man's basic motive is held to be, quote, what is in it for me? This certainly is largely true of fallen man who has adopted Satan's hypothesis. It is still a deformation of man's true nature and a burden upon it. Sin is a disease, a moral disease, a cancer in man which dooms him to death. It is not the nature of his original being, but a cancerous growth within it. Barzin calls attention also to this aspect of the novel, a product of the modern world and usually very humanistic. From its earliest years, says Barzin, the novel, quote, has persistently made war on two things, our culture and the heroic, end quote. Education has also been at war with our Christian culture and against excellence. Increasingly in the 20th century, teaching has been aimed at producing a mind cynical of the past and its great men, a mind sitting always in a judgment seat as a god over all else. Barzin, in pointing to the fact that, in our society, quote, the notion of excellence, end quote, is fading, observes, quote, this is surely the result of spurring the critical spirit while leaving it undirected, of, quote, thinking for oneself, end quote, without encountering the objections of a better thinker. I once had occasion to tell a group of graduate students that any of them would be lucky to achieve the 5th or 6th rank among historians. The remark was prompted by their dissatisfaction with all they knew. Gibbon was a bore, Macaulay a stuffed shirt, Hegel and Michelet were fools, Carlyle and Buckle frauds. This from students who could not write 10 pages of readable and properly documented narrative. Pointing out that even second- and third-rate men such as Milman, Bancroft or Grote were the superiors of these students' own instructors, who were by definition superior to the students themselves, was a sobering thought quite foreign to their experience. End quote. Our concern, however, is more directly with the undiluted urge to degrade. It is well known that perverts are usually intensely concerned with involving others in their offences, both by seduction and by reinterpretation of the actions of others. Thus, some reputed scholars have held that everyone has homosexual impulses and phases. Others make similar claims in terms of their own predilections. One man, a lecher and an atheist, spoke proudly of his honesty. All men, he held, are secretly lechers, and all men in their hearts know that God is a myth, and only he was honest enough to admit to both. Thus, all men are, according to him, as bad as he is, so that there is nothing wrong with his position, since it is normal. Moreover, by his quote-unquote honesty, he had given himself a position of eminence over all others. This is, in essence, self-righteousness. Self-righteousness is an assertion that righteousness is self-derived and that it is man's own accomplishment in terms of his own standards. This means that self-righteousness involves a prior claim to be one's own arbiter over right and wrong. The temptation of Satan, Genesis 3:5, was thus the essence of self-righteousness. Self-righteousness is thus at war against God's righteousness, and it is an indictment of God's law in favour of man's own do-it-yourself law. It will seek to degrade man by proving to man that God's law is not possible of attainment, that it is in reality a frustration and a limitation of man, and that man must recognise that total egoism, such as Max Stirner advocated, is the true and healthy way of life. Klosowski has pointed out that, for the Marquis de Sade, God was a necessity to justify his evil. Quote, to the extent that God can be viewed as the original guilty party who attacked man before man could attack him, to that extent, man has acquired the right and the strength to attack his neighbour. End quote. For Sade, the source of all evil was God, and evil is a freedom to be one's own God and to cut the restrictions on man's development imposed by God. The goal of Sadian man is, quote, the exaltation of the ego to its height, end quote. The aseity of God requires for the Satanists the aseity of man. Man must be his own God, dependent completely on his own will, his own potentiality, and his own desires. For man to bow to any will or law outside of himself is to sin against his own being. God, it is thus held, is the great egoist, and therefore man can be no different. Whether it be Job or a girl or boy next door or a man or woman seeking to obey God's law, they must be proven to be hypocrites. Quote, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. Job 2:4. They must be degraded in terms of their moral goals, or else they and that moral law stand as an indictment of these Satanists. There is an intensity to Satan's remarks about Job. The man was an offence to Satan, because Job's God was an offence to Satan. His goal was to make Job curse God to his face, to throw over God's law and righteousness, and to manifest an open and unbridled egoism. There is more than testing of Job in Satan's mind. There is hatred. Men who fail to recognize such hatred may well share it